Mothers and mothering have been topics that have been of great interest to me as a scholar, but also as a laywoman, who has 2 children. Right now, my kids are 20 and 16, and being a mother has taught me in very intimate ways the depth and usefulness of the Dharma for living my everyday life. When my children were born, from the first moments of their life, I knew that they were themselves. They weren't just extensions of me, and that as separate beings from me, I would find my relationships with them shifting over time as all relationships change given the reality of impermanence. Thinking about my own role as a mother and my experience of mothering has been very profound in my life as a laywoman, and I'm hoping to share some of that with you, both as a mother and the resources that I bring to it from Dharma teachings, and also from my scholarship, where I have focused on stories and teachings that engage with my life at the moment. And I think we can do our best thinking when we're coming from our personal experience. So I imagine many of you are lay women and you are working to raise children at the same time you're working on your Dharma practice. So I'm hoping that I can share some of the resources I know and the places of reflection I have reached with you as sisters on the path of life, as mothers of children, and as women practicing Dharma from our very busy, complex, and often chaotic lives. And so I'm just sort of putting together many different thoughts and reflections on Buddhist resources, and there's many others. And this is really just from my experience and from the Dharma resources that I happen to know primarily as a scholar of Buddhism. So from the Pali Canon, which I know most deeply, the Metta Sutta, which comes from the Pali Canon, there is a verse that says, we should love all beings just in the same way that a mother loves her child, her only child. And there's a teaching in the Tibetan tradition that says we should love all beings as if they were our mother, our only mother. And so we see that the act of loving children as a mother loves her children, or loving beings as we love our mothers, is a really powerful metaphor that's used in different Buddhist traditions to explain what love feels like in our most intimate relationship and most singular relationship of having a child or being the child of a mother. And at the same time that being the child of a particular woman or having a relationship with our own children, the children that a woman gives birth to, seems so singular and focused. These two teachings, one from the Metta Sutta and one from the Tibetan tradition, show us that these very particular intimate experiences of a child who has a relationship with their mother or a mother who has a relationship with their child, that those particular relationships are meant to be universalized. So from the one child to all people, from the one mother to all mothers. And so these teachings ask us to hold together both the singularity of relationships and the universality of relationships. And that is quite philosophical and quite abstract to do, but I think many of you will hear the importance of this sort of universality of compassion, how compassion is supposed to spread to all beings. But being a mother, being a child, asks us also to focus very intensely on the relationships that we live in our lives. So it's not all in the realm of the abstract, the philosophical. It's in our bodies. It's the people whose hands we hold. It's the children who we care with by feeding, by cleaning, by holding. And these aspects of life become very powerful sources for understanding foundational Buddhist thoughts. And that's been my experience. And I imagine it's been the experience for many of you. So one other thing I want to say at the beginning of this talk is there's a lot of questions of how closely motherhood and mothering are interwoven with gender, of how the cultures and societies that we live in define who can be a mother and what kind of bodies they have. Must it be a female body that can be a mother? Well, biologically, people assert, yes, you must have a womb to be a mother. So mothers live in sexed female bodies. Is it someone who identifies with a female gender that must be a condition for mothering? Many people and many Buddhist stories would say yes. But in our moment in time right now, those assertions are being questioned. And as a professor of undergraduate students in a college in the United States, I find that more and more of my college students are questioning those normative assumptions that there's a man and a woman, there's male bodies and female bodies, and they're questioning those absolute differences and saying, can we reach across those to create not an either or, but a both and that we can be both a mother and on a spiritual path. We can be a man who has a sexed male body and a nurturing role. And so this is where we are in the present moment in, I would say, my culture, the culture that I am located and I teach from, to my young students in American University. And why is this important? I think this is important because it helps us as readers think about some Buddhist texts that assert that that really look at the role of being a mother as something that escapes the limited boundaries of being a woman and being someone who identifies with a female gender. Well, what are those stories? These stories or kind of descriptions come in the Pali Canon. They come from stories surrounding the Buddha's mother, or more precisely, his stepmother, the woman who mothered him, Mahaprajapati Gautama, also known as Gautami. When the Buddha's mother died soon after the Buddha's birth, she asked her sister, as she lay dying, to please care for her son. This would be the child that would grow up to become the awakened Buddha, Gautama, also known as Shakyamuni. And as she was dying, her sister, who was also a queen in the kingdom, said, of course she would care for this child as if he were her own, and that this act of mothering wasn't determined or limited to the body that gave birth to him. And so in the story of this woman, her certain form of her name, Gautama or Gautami, depending on the tradition, that in some of the longer narratives around her life, this role of her mothering the person who would grow up to become the Buddha, she talks before her death to her son, this soon-to-be Buddha, who she tended to from babyhood until he leaves the life of his palace and his father's kingdom to become a renunciant and find the path to awakening. And when she is reaching her own death, she speaks about her relationship with the Buddha, the soon-to-be Buddha, and she says to him, this is from the Gautami Apadana from the Pali Canon, I raised you on mother's milk. You raised me on the milk of the Dhamma or the Dharma, the teachings, and I was mother to you. You were father to me. And this fluidity between caring, it goes beyond particular roles to all-encompassing possibilities of compassion and care, and I find that so powerful because it says we can all be in the roles of parenting. And so here I think it's really important that we move from the particular role of mother to the possibility of parenting, of generating the care that every child needs and being aware of and accessible to providing that kind of care, whether it be as mother or father, as a male or a female, that that action, rather than the descriptor of a noun of a mother, but that act of mothering is what defines so much of Buddhist ethics, of loving all beings as a mother loves her only child, of taking that very physical, intimate knowledge as you hold your child in your arms and feed it with your body's milk, to caring for all beings by, in whatever way you can, sharing the Dharma with them. And as a laywoman, my capacity to do that is quite small, but the reality that that is a gift that any of us can have. Now, in my conversations with other scholars, of feminist scholars, and as Buddhist practitioners, this line of interpretation can be seen as very diminishing towards women. Well, if we take the role of mothering away from belonging exclusively to women, here's one thing that women can claim as their own, and giving it to the Buddha then just diminishes that possibility of women's experience with their body, just taking it away from them. I myself don't see it that way. I see the universality of the possibility of parenting as something that we should hold up. And for me, I see it that way because it's not to deny the realities of how much sacrifice a woman makes when she makes the commitment to mother a child. As a mother, she is a mother who goes into having a child, if going into it with reflection, and I think especially reflection on the Buddhist teachings, she's preparing for a kind of self-renunciation, which can be so powerful, a way to experience anatta, of non-self, and an experience of interconnection. She will now be so entwined with this child if she is to care for that child with the highest levels of compassion and wisdom. By seeing examples of the Buddha as a parent and the shifting of Gautami and Gautama as who's the parent and who's the child, is the breast milk from the body, is the Dharma a kind of milk that comes from the transformation of the mind and the heart? Well, perhaps if we focus on parenting as much as mothering, but I don't want to deny or put aside mothering as a particular kind of act, and an act that deserves to be taken seriously and learned from and lived and celebrated. But if we see that as a shared value between men and women, mothers and fathers, then the responsibility of both parents to care for every person as if they were their only child. Then in families, Dharma families, it's everyone's opportunities and everyone's commitments, and everyone's commitment not only to the child, not only to the community that they live in, but also to make sure and to make it's a part of their ethical work to make the space for both mothers and fathers to have the space to do their Dharma practice in whatever form it takes. It is a partnership, and mothers, especially because it hasn't been the way society says how should time be prioritized. Mothers, though, need the time to do their practice. And as a parent, the men in the family, the fathers in the family, it's their responsibility to ensure that mothers in their household have the time and space for their Dharma practice just as much as the fathers and men want it for themselves. When I really focus on mothering, so I am a mother, that's a role that I fill, but when I see mothering as an active, intimate practice, those two things, I think it's important to create some space between them, because being a mother carries all these assumptions and definitions and values of what being a mother should be. When I see mothering as an action, maybe I would say, rather than a role, that it's a verb, then it's easier for me to to see that it's a site where I can learn the realities of Dharma teachings very vividly in my everyday life. And so I thought I would talk about that for a few moments. Mothering can seem to be contrary to the Buddhist teaching of non-attachment. Anyone who's watching this who is a mother might find it very easy to understand that mothering is one of the most powerful forms of attachment. That we find our love for our children is unlike any other form of love, even for our fathers, our father and mothers, or even our partners. There's something about mothering, the responsibility of the well-being of another person that they literally couldn't survive without us, and generates a kind of love that is unlike any other kind of love or concern. I find with my undergraduate students that when I use the example of being a mother as a way to help them understand impermanence and non-attachment, they can't understand how you could love with non-attachment. They think non-attachment means you can't be attached to anybody. And how could you possibly love without being attached? I think as a mother, though, the most successful form of love I find as a mother with my children is to be non-attached, but present and aware, concerned and present. And so that is to love with non-attachment, but not detachment, as I think non-attachment is often misunderstood in Western Buddhism, that if we're not attached to anything or anyone. We must be detached, which I think brings up images or postures that seem cold and uncaring, that just aren't present, that don't have a depth of caring or investment. And I think that's completely wrong. To love with non-attachment is to love with such presence in the particular moment as it changes from one moment to the next. And it is such a powerful resource for parents as we're parenting, either mothering or fathering or any kind of care that we learn from parenting. It allows the person being cared for to be constantly evolving and changing, as they must, because all things are impermanent, and it's amazing how quickly we change and how quickly our needs change. And any parent knows that what a child needs from one day to the next, as a baby, it's very apparent, and for a parent can make those adjustments. But as a child grows and becomes a teenager, what a teenager needs from one day to the next, or from one moment to the next, may be happening at warp speed. And if you're very well skilled in understanding the teachings of impermanence and non-attachment, it can be such a powerful resource for parenting with non-attachment, and allowing for the well-being of both the parent and the child. And so those are some of the Buddhist teachings that I think are incredibly valuable. I'll give a small example. As my son left home to go to college on the opposite sides of the country, he was for the first time going to be making his decisions on his own. And when he was in his high school years, his teenage years, I tried to be very attentive and aware of what was going on, but giving him enough freedom to start making choices for himself, because I knew he was soon going to be far, far away from me. But when he came home for his holidays, we sort of slipped back into the old patterns of him asking permission from his father or his mother of could he do this, could he do that, and we were pretty still attached to that. But now, as more time has passed and he comes home, he tells us where he's going or what his activities are, more as a form of right behavior, knowing that his decisions of where he's going to eat dinner that night are going to be interconnected with the food that we make and when we consume it. But he doesn't need our permission anymore. He's an adult now, and that can be hard for a parent to realize that change has happened. Oh, this child whose diapers I changed lovingly and sang songs to as I wiped his dirty bottom, is now the one who needs to unclog his toilet if it's become a mess. And if he doesn't do that, I'm going to be mad at him. You live here. You need to do this adult work. And so that's kind of a silly example. But allowing our children to grow and grow into new responsibilities, it can be very painful if we're holding on to them in a particular loving form. But parenting is such a wonderful practice for doing that. But I want to repeat something I said earlier, that no one can use parenting as a form of practicing the Dharma unless they are supported to have the time and space to have time to focus on caring for themselves, which includes their Dharma practice. Parenting does not automatically become a practice of the Dharma unless it can be cultivated and reflected on as an experience of impermanence or interconnected. That takes time and space for reflection. Another point that I want to raise is that when the role of being a mother or the actions of mothering, and again, I want us to think more broadly about parenting, become idealized. And we get into that danger of idealizing a mother, a father, the actions of parenting, when we see them as sort of more in these abstract forms, as how we see them in particular suttas or stories, and don't look at how they're applied in particular times and places. When we idealize them that way, we fail to think about particular women and men who are living complicated, full lives without the support that they may need. Another thing is when we look at the ideals that we might find in Buddhist scriptures or Buddhist stories, the ideal mother, that can put a lot of pressure on women who are living the role of mother as they're practicing the Dharma. And so let's go back to one of the first suttas I quoted from, the Metta Sutta, that we should love all children as a mother loves her only child. That's idealizing a mother's love to say that it's perfect. You never make a mistake. You never, after a long day of work and cooking a meal, and then having to bathe your child and guide them into sleep and then maybe go back to work, that perfect mother never loses it. She never screams. She never cries. She never has a moment where she thinks, this child who I love more than I love myself, and I always will, isn't smothering me to death. And so we need to be really careful that while we may see this role of mother as just an incredible resource for self-transformation, we can't use it as a way to put pressure, especially on women who are Dharma practitioners, to believe that the only way they can be mothers who are spiritually transforming not only their child but themselves is they have to do it perfectly in every moment. And there are plenty of examples in Buddhist narratives that show mothers who are far from perfect. And maybe I'll just point you to some of those so that we can say that Buddhists imagined mothers who did harm, and they couldn't always be a perfect Dharma practitioner, and they created harm not only for themselves but their child and those around them, and there were conditions that led them to that. And especially it was that they didn't have enough conditions of care for themselves and their child, and that raising a child shouldn't be a solitary act. They needed the support of a community that wasn't there for them. And I'll just point you to the Tibetan classic, The Life of Milarepa, where Milarepa, this great Tibetan yogi who, his life story is a Tibetan classic and an amazing tale of transformation in a single lifetime. But his mother does incredible harm to her family and to him. But that's because of the terrible position she was put in, and no one stepped in to help her. So again, that story can be used in this day and age by applying it to where in our own neighborhoods, our own cities, in our own countries, do we see single mothers who do not have the resources to raise their children without, just falling into mental despair, and so harm is done. And let me just say that my own life experience about the need for communities to care for mothers in their mothering and for the child is something I know personally, because when my eldest child was just 1 year old, I found out that I had a brain tumor. And the entire time that I've been raising my children, I've known that this tumor could become cancerous. And indeed, we found that out, that it is cancerous, and it is an incurable form of cancer. And it's been part of the way I've been able to live with that illness, and raising my child, to recognize and emphasize that my children are loved not only by me, but by a community of people who will continue to love and care for them whether I'm still alive or not. I also know the other experience of being a child who was raised by a mother who needed help and didn't receive it. My mother had a mental illness that was not diagnosed, that wasn't cared for in 1970s. I think today she would have been easily diagnosed as bipolar and she could have been treated, but in the 1970s that was not the case. And when her mental state got unbalanced, she became very rageful, and there were several times in my childhood when her actions could have killed me. And it's been one of the greatest challenges of my life to understand why my mother acted in those ways, and how I could find evidence of her love for me interconnected with that rage and that harm. And I think with a lot of work, it's possible to do that. And it was scary for me to decide to become a mother when I had been brought up by such an abusive parent. I'm glad that I had the courage to do that. Being a mother has been the greatest achievement of my life, and no matter, that I have a PhD from Harvard or I'm a full professor of Buddhist studies, my greatest accomplishment, the greatest moments of joy have been mothering my children. I could have been a much better Buddhist practitioner had I had the time that I spent driving my children to their soccer games, sitting in the stands cheering for them, making dinners rather than sitting on my meditation cushions. But I feel the transformation of myself as a person who can love with an open heart and an open mind has been the most valuable treasure of my life. There are periods of time in my life where the fear of what would happen to my children in the future really consumed me, and I can imagine that for many parents, for their own reasons, they have these fears as well. I mean, mine were very particular, and I would say even selfish, because they were my fears that came from the question of when will I die? I have an incurable disease, so I know I would die. I didn't know when, and I hoped it would be after my children are grown. But there are so many parents around the world who are fearful for their children because of war and famine and the danger of kidnapping and so many other things, that my fear seems to me almost selfish as I'm thinking it through just in this present moment. But it's still my fear, and it's still real. And I was very afraid, and I was speaking to my dear friend, the Venerable Damsha, Diana Finnegan, and as I was speaking to her, I was saying, I've worked so hard to give my my children an unconditional love, that I will always love them without conditions. And she said to me, all things have conditions, and it made me think, there's no such thing as unconditional love. There will always be conditions for love, and I can create other conditions for my children's love. I can see them to calm my own fear so that I didn't have to live with that fear. I can make them visible to my children so they know that they're there. And that was such an incredibly important teaching, especially going back to the way in which mothers are idealized, that mothers have to love unconditionally. Well, we know from Buddhism that nothing exists without conditions. And so we have to understand the conditions of love and show our children how to put the right conditions in place so that they'll live with positive, healing love. And there's so many ways I've found of doing that. It's pointing to friends whose love is just tremendous and consistent. But it's very simple things like the beauty that I find in nature. That's a condition for love. I love nature, and it transforms me. And since my children were very, very little, I would always point to a cloud and say, look at that cloud, isn't it beautiful? Or do you hear that bird song? How beautiful is that? And even as we were driving down a road in Southern California in the heat of summer when everything is brown, I pointed to a very brown hillside that had some scrub bushes that had a kind of reddish tinge to them. And I said, look at that brown hill in contrast to that red weed. Isn't that beautiful? And my daughter said, Mom, you can find beauty in anything. And that was a lesson that I wanted to teach to them, because if there's beauty in the world everywhere we look, then the world can't just be suffering. It has to be more than just suffering. And I hope that that'll be a condition that I've given them that will allow them to live with love and inspiration, and not only suffering, which I know they'll have, because we all suffer, right? That first noble truth. But life is more than that.